Pwave overview.
The Pwave is the first positive deflection on the ECG and represents atrial depolarization. The Pwave is the first positive deflection on the ECG. 1. It represents atrial depolarization.
2. Normal duration, less than 0.12 s, less than 120 milliseconds or 3 small squares.
3.
Characteristics of the normal sinus Pwave.
Morphology. Smooth contour. 1.
Monophasic in lead 2.
2. Biphasic in V1. 3. Axis. Normal Pwave axis is between 0 degrees and plus 75 degrees. 1.
Pwaves should be upright in leads I and 2, inverted in AVR.
2. Duration. Amplitude. Less than 2.5 millimeters, 0.25 millivolts, in the limb leads. 1.
Less than 1.5 millimeters, 0.15 millivolts, in the precordial leads.
2. Atrial abnormalities are most easily seen in the inferior leads, 2, 3 and AVF, and lead V1, as the Pwaves are most prominent in these leads.
The atrial waveform, relationship to the Pwave.
Atrial depolarization proceeds sequentially from right to left, with the right atrium activated before the left atrium. 1. The right and left atrial waveforms summate to form the Pwave. 2. The first one-third of the Pwave corresponds to right atrial activation. The final one-third corresponds to left atrial activation. The middle one-third is a combination of the two. 3. In most leads, e.g. lead 2, the right and left atrial waveforms move in the same direction, forming a monophasic Pwave. 4. However, in lead V1 the right and left atrial waveforms move in opposite directions. 5. This produces a biphasic Pwave with the initial positive deflection corresponding to right atrial activation and the subsequent negative deflection denoting left atrial activation. 6. This separation of right and left atrial electrical forces in lead V1 means that abnormalities affecting each individual atrial waveform can be discerned in this lead. 6. Elsewhere, the overall shape of the Pwave is used to infer the atrial abnormality.
Normal Pwave morphology, lead 2.
1. The right atrial depolarization wave, brown, precedes that of the left atrium, blue. 2.
The combined depolarization wave, the Pwave, is less than 120 milliseconds wide and less than 2.5 millimeters high.
Right atrial enlargement, lead 2. 1. In right atrial enlargement, right atrial depolarization lasts longer than normal and its waveform extends to the end of left atrial depolarization. 2.
Although the amplitude of the right atrial depolarization current remains unchanged, its peak now falls on top of that of the left atrial depolarization wave. 3. The combination of these two waveforms produces a Pwaves that is taller than normal, greater than 2.5 millimeters, although the width remains unchanged, less than 120 milliseconds. Left atrial enlargement, lead 2. 1. In left atrial enlargement, left atrial depolarization lasts longer than normal but its amplitude remains unchanged. 2. Therefore, the height of the resultant Pwave remains within normal limits but its duration is longer than 120 milliseconds. 3. A notch, broken line, near its peak may or may not be present, P mitrail. Normal Pwave morphology, lead V1.
The Pwave is typically biphasic in V1, with similar sizes of the positive and negative deflections. Right atrial enlargement, lead V1. Right atrial enlargement causes increased height, greater than 1.5 millimeters, in V1 of the initial positive deflection of the Pwave. Left atrial enlargement, V1. Left atrial enlargement causes widening, greater than 40 milliseconds wide, and deepening, greater than 1 millimeter deep, in V1 of the terminal negative portion of the Pwave. Biatrial enlargement. Biatrial enlargement is diagnosed when criteria for both right and left atrial enlargement are present on the same ECG. The spectrum of Pwave changes in leads 2 and V1 with right, left and biatrial enlargement is summarized in the following diagram.
Common P-wave abnormalities. 1. P mitral, bifid P waves, seen with left atrial enlargement. 2. P pulmonale, peaked P waves, seen with right atrial enlargement. 3. P wave inversion, seen with ectopic atrial and junctional rhythms. 4. Variable P wave morphology, seen in multifocal atrial rhythms. P mitral. The presence of broad, notched, bifid P waves in lead 2 is a sign of left atrial enlargement, classically due to mitral stenosis. P pulmonale. The presence of tall, peaked P waves in lead 2 is a sign of right atrial enlargement, usually due to pulmonary hypertension, e.g. cor pulmonale from chronic respiratory disease. Inverted P waves. P wave inversion in the inferior leads indicates a non-sinus origin of the P waves. When the PR interval is less than 120 milliseconds, the origin is in the AV junction, e.g. accelerated junctional rhythm. When the PR interval is greater than or equal to 120 milliseconds, the origin is within the atria, e.g. ectopic atrial rhythm. Variable P wave morphology. The presence of multiple P wave morphologies indicates multiple ectopic pacemakers within the atria and/or AV junction. If is greater than or equal to 3 different P wave morphologies are seen, then multifocal atrial rhythm is diagnosed. If is greater than or equal to 3 different P wave morphologies are seen and the rate is greater than or equal to 100, then multifocal atrial tachycardia, MAT, is diagnosed.